My first instinct was to jump overboard. That was how Air Group 9 leader Lieutenant Commander Philip H. Torrey Jr. described his reaction to hearing the loudspeaker on USS Essex announce the target of their upcoming strike, the notorious Japanese base of Truk Lagoon. Known as the Gibraltar of the Pacific, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, shore batteries, airfields, and battleships, it was virtually impenetrable. A one-way ticket to the bottom of the ocean for any pilot or captain foolish enough to attempt an attack. The island fortress was so remote and protected that few Allied personnel had ever even seen it. In February 1944, the American carrier fleet was about to do the unthinkable, the ultimate payback for Pearl Harbor. A daring assault on Truk and the many Japanese ships anchored there. If they could pull it off, this would be more than a hard rain. This was Operation Hailstone. Background. The seeds of Operation Hailstone were sown 2 weeks earlier when the U.S. Army and Marine Corps completed their successful capture of Kwajalein Atoll from the Japanese. Having achieved a speedy victory there, the Commander-in-Chief of Pacific Command, Admiral Chester Nimitz, was eager to continue the Allies' island-hopping advance toward Tokyo. He now had his sights set on Enuitak Atoll, some 340 miles northwest of Kwajalein, which would provide his forces with a firm springboard from which to invade the Mariana Islands even further northwest. And crucially, within B-29 superfortress range of Japan itself. But before taking Enuitak, the Marianas, or Japan, the Allies would first have to deal with Truk. Part of the nearby Caroline Islands, this mysterious Japanese base was shrouded in secrecy and was strictly off-limits to foreigners ever since the Japanese first began occupying it after World War I. Yet rumors suggested it was an impregnable bastion of Imperial naval strength, a heavily defended safe haven for the nation's combined fleet. As the U.S. island-topped its way across the Pacific, the fabled Truk would invariably appear in mess hall chatter, its mere name striking terror into the hearts of American servicemen. Though nobody had actually seen it, few had any desire to do so. Despite the atoll's fearsome aura, the U.S. wasted no time in sending a reconnaissance mission to uncover the true extent of Japanese power there. The same day that Kwajalein fell to the Allies, 2 Bougainville-based consolidated PV-4Y1s from the Marine Photographic Squadron 254 were ordered to fly over Truk at high altitude to gather images that would help to plan an attack on the enigmatic base. The 2 reconnaissance aircraft carefully navigated their way toward their objective until finally it appeared before them. 11 jagged volcanic islands jutting out of the blue Pacific waters, surrounded by a ring-shaped barrier reef with a circumference of 140 miles. It was immediately clear why the Japanese had chosen this place as one of its key bases. Not only was it perfectly located at the center of the Japanese-mandated islands, but it provided an excellent natural anchorage with plenty of space to house the entire combined fleet. Frustratingly, the aircraft found the atoll partly covered in clouds, preventing them from gathering data about the entire area. Yet as they drew closer, they were able to photograph several vessels of the fleet, as well as a number of transport ships. For the Americans, Truk made for an extremely valuable target, but a successful attack would require considerable strength. The plan. Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the 5th Fleet, decided that the responsibility of attacking the anchorage would fall to Task Force 58. It had replaced Task Force 38 as the main U.S. naval strike force in the Pacific just a few weeks earlier and was under the command of Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher. While one of its 4 task groups would be assigned to support Operation Flintlock, the amphibious assault on Enuitak, the other 3 would carry out Operation Hailstone, the raid on Truk. In total, this comprised 5 fleet carriers: USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown, USS Essex, USS Intrepid, and USS Bunker Hill, as well as 4 light carriers: USS Belleau Wood, USS Cabot, USS Monterey, and USS Cowpens. Between them, they carried over 500 warplanes, including fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. The carriers were supported by 7 battleships and various heavy cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. There was no denying that the U.S. Navy had a powerful force to work with. But if they were to succeed in neutralizing the famously formidable Truk, they knew they would need to plan the raid extremely carefully. Yet they soon realized that, despite its daunting image, it had an Achilles heel, one they intended to exploit to maximum effect. Using intelligence gathered from intercepted radio traffic, the Americans knew the Japanese radar was designed to catch incoming aircraft above a certain altitude. Therefore, by flying at low level, U.S. aircraft could approach the atoll undetected and carry out a lethal strike before the enemy had time to react. The parallels with Pearl Harbor were not lost on the U.S. Navy, but this time the shoe would be on the other foot. The surprise attack. In the misty pre-dawn twilight of February 17th, a wave of Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters took off from the decks of Task Force 58's fleet carriers, keeping close to the water to maintain the element of surprise. In a brand new strategy created by Rear Admiral Mitcher, these fighters were tasked with clearing the way for the main bombing raid by eliminating any Japanese aircraft that might provide resistance, both shooting down those already in the air and executing strafing runs against those parked on Truk's various airfields. Nearing the atoll, the Hellcats separated out to different altitudes. 24 remained low, 23 took the medium altitudes, and 22 soared to 25,000 feet to provide cover. As they drew closer, it soon became clear the U.S. Navy's plan had worked. The Japanese were caught woefully unprepared for their sudden arrival. In fact, the combined fleet commander, Admiral Mineichi Koga, had been informed of the American reconnaissance aircraft spotted flying overhead 13 days earlier. Suspecting an attack on Truk could be under preparation, he sent most of the fleet to safety in Palau. However, many ships were left behind, including 2 light cruisers, 8 destroyers, and several auxiliary vessels from the combined fleet, as well as an extensive array of transports loaded with vast quantities of tanks, vehicles, aircraft, artillery, and shells, not to mention hundreds of Japanese troops. What's more, on Truk itself, there were more than 200 replacement aircraft, left rather vulnerable as they sat packed tightly together on the atoll's airfields, while they waited for pilots to arrive to fly them to the main combat zones. Meanwhile, the main responsibility of providing airborne protection fell to the 22nd and 26th Koku Sentai, or air flotillas of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Force. However, having been on high alert for nearly 2 weeks after the reconnaissance aircraft were spotted, the pilots from these units had been given shore leave. This meant that in the early morning of February 17th, there were no active air patrols. By the time the first blips finally appeared on Japanese radar, it was already too late. The pilots scrambled to their aircraft as quickly as possible, but as they began hurriedly taking off, the Hellcats were already bearing down on them. The supposedly invincible Truk suddenly seemed terribly exposed. Low-level attack. Leading the charge at low level with USS Enterprise-based Squadron VF-10, the famous fighter squadron nicknamed the Grim Reapers, Lieutenant Commander William Killer Kane was among the first to make contact. 4 Mitsubishi A6M0, or Zeke fighters, appeared to his right and attempted a pass against Kane and his wingman, Lieutenant Junior grade Vernon Udy. The American pilot shot down 1 each before Udy sent a third up in flames. The pair then flew low over the Eaton runway, where they encountered 2 Nakajima Ki-44 Shokis, or Tojos, of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, just as they were taking off. Barely did the Japanese fighter interceptors make it off the ground before they found themselves hurtling back towards it, Kane living up to his nickname once more. Yet plenty of Japanese fighters had managed to take to the skies successfully, and now Kane, Udy, and the rest of the Grim Reapers found themselves locked in a bitter dogfight with more Zeros, as well as several formations of Nakajima A6M2N Navy Type 2 floatplane fighters, nicknamed Roofs. Lieutenant Junior grade Joseph Frenchy Roulet took out a Zeke from behind, then gave chase to a roof. As the Japanese floatplane looped upwards in an attempt to escape Roulet's fire, the plucky U.S. pilot followed, delivering a fatal blow just as his F-6F was on the point of stalling. Roulet then eliminated a Mitsubishi A6M3 Model 32, essentially a square-winged Zero, marking his hat trick for the morning. Though the melee cost VF-10 1 Hellcat, along with its pilot, Ensign Linton Cox, it also resulted in 14 aerial victories, as well as an additional 5 aircraft destroyed on Eaton Airfield. Meanwhile, the other low-level squadron, USS Yorktown's VF-5, had been assigned the Dublin Seaplane Base as its target. Upon arrival, 8 of the group's 12 Hellcats flew low to carry out the strafe attack, successfully taking out 5 enemy flying boats before heading skywards once more to join their comrades in the escalating dogfight. Between them, they shot down 3 Zeeks, 3 Roofs, and a Mitsubishi F-1M2 reconnaissance seaplane, known to the Allies as a Pete, with just one F-6F lost to Truk's anti-aircraft defenses, which proved to be significantly less extensive than the Americans had originally believed. Medium-altitude fighter action. Immediately above VF-5 and VF-10 were VF-6 and VF-9 from USS Intrepid and USS Essex, respectively. After approaching Truk at an altitude of around 14,000 feet, as they neared their target of Moen Island Airfield, 10 of the 12 Hellcats of VF-6 dropped down low in preparation for their strafing run, leaving just Lieutenant Junior grade Alexander Verasiu and his wingman Ensign Lewis Little at altitude. Suddenly, the 2 pilots realized they were not as alone as they had first thought. Flying above them was a squadron of Zeeks that had managed to climb to altitude before the lower-level Hellcats could catch them. The pair quickly responded by going in to attack, taking advantage of the F-6F's superior handling to get the upper hand over the enemy fighters. Verasiu later explained, quote, "We noticed that the Jap pilots weren't reluctant to attack, but once they were cornered, they dived steeply for the water or cloud cover. The Hellcat can outmaneuver the Zero at speeds of 250 knots and better, so we began to follow them down." For Verasiu, this strategy proved devastatingly effective, allowing him to gun down 2 Zeeks and a Roof before catching another Zero as it came through the clouds. Perem and Moen were also the targets of VF-9, but just as the squadron was approaching the islands, a surprise attack by a group of Japanese fighters saw the 3 Hellcats that made up its 3rd Division separated from not just the rest of the squadron, but from each other. In the intense burst of aerial combat that followed, Lieutenant Charles Moutonat neutralized 1 Japanese fighter, while Lieutenant Junior grade Bill Bonneau claimed 4 victories. At the same time, the division's 3rd pilot, Lieutenant Junior grade Eugene Valencia, found himself bracketed by a group of 6 or more Zeeks. He performed an impressive dive from 14,000 feet, down to where his F-6F barely skimmed the waves, but the Zeros followed him down. He coolly dispatched 2 of them as they pulled up ahead, before downing the group's leader as he turned, and then headed back to USS Essex. Upon arrival, Valencia gave the credit for his success in battle to his Hellcat, exclaiming, quote, "Those Grummons are beautiful aeroplanes. If they could cook, I'd marry one." Valencia would later go on to become the 3rd highest-scoring U.S. Navy fighter ace of World War II, racking up 23 victories. Simultaneously, the 2nd Division of VF-9 came up against a number of Zero formations. The division's leader, Lieutenant Jack Kitchen, nailed a Roof head-on before turning his sights on a Zeke. A solid burst from the Hellcat's M2 Brownings sent the enemy aircraft plummeting toward the Pacific waters, though its fate remained unknown. With the 2nd and 3rd Divisions of VF-9 dealing with the enemy fighters, the 1st Division was left free to carry out strafing runs on Moen and Perem, setting fire to at least 25 grounded aircraft across the 2 islands, as well as gunning down several that had recently taken off, raising the squadron's total number of aerial victories to 21, while losing just 1 F-6F. USS Bunker Hill's VF-18, which had been assigned to provide top cover, had a far less eventful sortie, with most of the action taking place far below them. Nevertheless, they still managed to score 1 victory and another probable. The fighter sweep had yielded excellent results. The Japanese aircraft had been unable to match the technical prowess of the F-6F Hellcats, and many had paid the ultimate price, while U.S. losses had been minimal. The bombing begins. With a large chunk of potential aerial resistance efficiently eliminated, American dive and torpedo bombers were now free to wreak havoc on the vessels and infrastructure in the lagoon. The plan was for the bombers to perform a total of 6 strikes on the first day of the attack. These were designated A to F and were programmed to take place every 2 hours, with the departure times for each task group staggered in 15-minute intervals to give each set of bombers space to attack the specific targets it had been given. These bomber squadrons would be escorted by another group of Hellcats to take care of any remaining aerial threats. 7 Air Group 10 Grumman TBF Avengers and their escorts followed the path of destruction left by the group's fighter sweep. Zooming over Eaton Airfield, they plastered the runway with fragmentation bombs and incendiary clusters before strafing the remaining aircraft on the ground. However, Several Zero squadrons that had not been eliminated by the initial fighter sweep were still active in the area. As he pulled up from the strafing run, F-6F pilot Lieutenant Junior grade Walter Harmon suddenly saw a Zeke underneath him. A short but solid burst of fire hit the Zero's engine, sending it spiraling into the waves below. The other Air Group 10 escorts added to the group's total, with another 5 victories between them. 15 minutes later, Moen Seaplane Base fell victim to a similar bombing and strafing attack by Air Group 6, while the group's fighters downed a further 3 enemy aircraft. Meanwhile, the rest of the bombers, including Douglas SBD Dauntless and Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, as well as more Avengers, focused their attack on the multiple ships anchored in Truk Lagoon, causing serious damage that left several vessels emitting towering billows of thick black smoke. Among the first to be sunk was the merchant tanker Hoyo Maru, which fell victim to an attack from Air Group 10's dive-bombing squadron leader, Lieutenant Commander James D. Ramage, while Air Group 10's Dauntlesses scored hits on the enormous 19,200-ton converted whaling ship Tonan Maru No. 3 with a pair of 1,000-pound bombs, leaving the vessel sternless and sinking. Around 8:30 a.m., an Avenger, piloted by Lieutenant James E. Bridges, dropped one of its torpedoes on the Japanese vessel Ikoku Maru. The hit itself might have been survivable, but not with what she was carrying on board. As an ammunition ship, her forward hold was packed with hundreds of mines, bombs, and magazines stored close together. As the torpedo came crashing down, it detonated this massive arsenal with devastating consequences. The front part of the ship was utterly destroyed. Where the 492-foot vessel's bow had been just moments earlier, there was nothing but debris raining down across the lagoon. The blast was so powerful, it even gouged a crater in the seabed below. As the force of the detonation ripped through the entire ship, it instantly claimed the lives of the 730 troops who had been housed in the aft section, as well as almost all the crew. Of the total 946 people who'd been on board Ikoku Maru, only one survived. Lieutenant Bridges and his aircrew also lost their lives in the explosion. No escape. With the first round of bombing strikes complete, the second began an hour and 15 minutes later, followed by several more. By this point, the remaining Japanese vessels could see the writing on the wall and focus their efforts on trying to escape. The light cruiser Katori, auxiliary cruiser Akagi Maru, destroyers Maikaze and Nawaki, and minesweeper Shonan Maru No. 15 began making a dash for Truk Lagoon's North Pass exit. But the American aircraft were determined to stop them before they could get away. Air Group 10's Avengers unleashed their torpedoes on Katori and Maikaze, tearing holes in each of them, while a series of successful bomb strikes on Akagi Maru caused violent explosions that left her crew no choice but to abandon ship and transfer to the already damaged Katori. Soon, more and more air groups joined the effort to prevent the Japanese ships from leaving the lagoon, pounding them repeatedly with various types of ordnance. However, it was not an aircraft that delivered the final blows to Katori and Maikaze. While the air groups of Task Force 58 had been causing carnage inside the lagoon, on board the nearby battleship USS New Jersey, Vice Admiral Spruance was informed that Japanese ships were attempting to flee Truk and decided to block their departure himself. Though considered by many of his own staff to be a somewhat reckless decision, and perhaps unnecessary given the already one-sided nature of the battle, Spruance was eager to engage in ship-to-ship combat, so Mitcher called off the aerial attacks on the vessels. Appointing himself the commander of Task Group 59, made up of New Jersey alongside fellow battleship USS Iowa, as well as heavy cruisers USS New Orleans and USS Minneapolis and 4 destroyers, Spruance led an around-the-atoll cruise, bombarding the shoreline as he went. Upon reaching the crippled enemy vessels, Iowa pounded Katori with a series of salvos that finally sent her to the bottom of the ocean. Remarkably, Maikaze managed to fire several torpedoes at New Jersey, but fortunately for Spruance and his crew, they were alerted by an overhead U.S. aircraft, and the battleship was able to maneuver just in time. Reflecting on the near miss, Spruance later commented, quote, "That would have been embarrassing." New Orleans and Minneapolis soon sent the badly damaged Japanese destroyer to join Katori on the seabed. This engagement would mark the only occasion in their careers in which Iowa and New Jersey fired their main guns at enemy vessels. The diminutive minesweeper Shonan Maru No. 15 was unable to hold out against heavy fire from the American destroyer USS Burns, yet fought courageously to the last, firing her guns even as she slipped below the waves. The only Japanese ship to escape was Milwaukee. New Jersey and Iowa tried to go after her, but despite launching several salvos, including one from 22 miles away, thought to be the longest-range gunshot ever fired at an enemy vessel, they were unable to stop her. However, by this time, the Japanese submarine chaser CH-24 was also trying to make her way out of the lagoon. Spotting Burns, despite her smaller size, she boldly opened fire on the U.S. destroyer with her single 3-inch gun. Unsurprisingly, her brave attack was over quickly. As the ship started sinking and her crew of approximately 60 men jumped overboard, Burns attempted to rescue the Japanese sailors from the water, but their help was refused. The Americans managed to drag 6 men out of the water by force, but the rest would not allow themselves to be picked up, believing they could swim back to Truk and be rescued by their countrymen. Unable to permit that to happen, Burns' commander decided the only option was to drop 3 depth charges on the sailors. Into the night. By now, night had descended over Truk Lagoon, and though the chances of saving Truk seemed to grow slimmer by the minute, the Japanese continued resisting courageously. At 7 p.m., the ships of Task Force 58 were attacked by a small group of Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, nicknamed Kates, retrofitted with radar to allow them to operate at night. Though most of the Kates were kept at bay by the American vessel's anti-aircraft fire, one managed to break through, even evading a night fighter sent up to intercept it. Swooping over USS Intrepid soon after 10 p.m., the torpedo bomber scored a direct hit on the carrier's starboard quarter, causing devastating damage. 11 men lost their lives, 17 were left wounded, and the carrier's rudder was knocked out of action, forcing her to pull out of the war for several months while undergoing repairs. Though it was an unfortunate setback, it would take far more than that to dissuade Rear Admiral Mitcher from finishing what he had started. As the battle entered the early hours of February 18th, he would test out another radical new tactic by ordering a nocturnal carrier bombing attack for the first time in the history of the U.S. Navy. 12 Avengers from Air Group 10, specially modified for night operations, took off from Enterprise, each one loaded with 4 500-pound bombs, and headed back into Truk Lagoon, hoping to sink any remaining Japanese ships. As they flew over the atoll, a red flare went up from Moen Island, a signal to the anti-aircraft batteries that an attack was imminent. Streams of flak filled the sky once more, the Japanese gunners using the Avengers' exhaust flames to locate them. During the 30-minute bombing raid, several TBFs were hit, yet only one was lost, while 8 Japanese ships were destroyed and 5 damaged. Finishing the job. As dawn broke once more, Task Force 58 launched a fresh wave of attacks on Truk. Following the playbook that had worked so well the previous day, they began with a fighter sweep. However, this time, the Hellcats found they had the skies to themselves. It seemed that any surviving Japanese aircraft had left the base under cover of darkness, no doubt bound for safer shores. With no aerial resistance to speak of, the F-6Fs carried out another round of strafing runs on the airfields at Eton, Moen, and Perem before going after any ship still afloat. Yet despite the lack of enemy fighters, a threat was still posed by anti-aircraft fire, as Pilot Lieutenant Junior Grade George Blair soon found out. Caught by flak during the last strafing run, he was forced to ditch in the lagoon. As Blair boarded his life raft and waited to be rescued, his squadron mates circled above, determined to protect him. Tension rose as a Japanese destroyer began heading towards him, but a series of effective strafing runs by the F-6Fs convinced her to turn back. However, having already been in the sky for some time, the Hellcats' fuel was rapidly running low, and one by one, they were forced to drop out and head back to the carriers. After half an hour, only 2 American fighters remained near the exhausted Blair. Fortunately, by that time, a Vought OS-2U-3 Kingfisher floatplane from USS Baltimore was on its way to save him, and soon enough, he was safely in the Kingfisher's rear cockpit. Arriving back on Baltimore with Blair, the Kingfisher's crew realized how close a call it had been. They had just 1 pint of fuel left in the tank. The last strike on Truk was directed at Dublin Island's oil storage tanks. Mitcher knew all too well that the burning oil would be bound to cause a large amount of smoke that could disrupt visibility for strikes against the lagoon's airfields and shipping, so he had deliberately saved this target until last. Sure enough, As Air Group 10's Dauntlesses and Avengers dropped their payloads on the tanks, massive columns of oily black smoke rose skyward, a fitting grand finale. Aftermath and legacy. The attack on Truk Lagoon was a resounding victory for the United States. By the end of February 18th, they'd destroyed 10 vessels of the Imperial Japanese Navy, 31 merchant ships, and around 270 of the 365 aircraft that had been based on the atoll. They had also destroyed approximately 17,000 tons of stored fuel. By contrast, just 25 American aircraft had been lost or damaged beyond repair, with the only other notable damage being that caused by the torpedo attack on USS Intrepid. The U.S. had carried out its own Pearl Harbor on the Japanese, using innovative strategies to finally bust the myth of the unconquerable Truk Lagoon. With the stronghold eliminated, they were able to take Inuitak without major interference, providing a jumping-off point for the subsequent American invasion of the Mariana Islands that marked a major step forward on their way to winning the war. While some attempts were made by the Japanese to rebuild Truk in the months following the assault, Vice Admiral Spruance sent another carrier strike on April 29th to halt their progress, while the atoll was also subject to another attack by British forces in June 1945. Today, Truk Lagoon is known as one of the world's largest underwater graveyards of ships and aircraft, and is a popular destination for scuba divers.